In concluding, I'm going to try to speculate a little bit about a post-Cold War world. That's the cliche that everybody is using to try to explain or describe the world that we live in today. Nobody quite knows what it means, probably because we haven't been there yet. But I think that what we see in a post-Cold War world is a beginning of a shift in the tectonic plates of international politics. Hitherto, as we've looked and talked about in earlier lectures, the structures of international politics have often been set by the aftermath of the great wars. Certainly the world that we lived in for the last 4 decades was set by the world of 1945. Indeed, with the unification of Germany, we saw the 4 powers who had been the victors finally agreeing to give up their rights in Berlin, to agree to the unification of Germany. That had a strange echo of a world that's now long departed. And in 1989, we saw basically a set of revolutions in Eastern Europe, indeed a year of revolution, the crumbling of the Iron Curtain that Churchill had talked about in 46. These were, if you like, the rumblings, the shakings of the international system that follow the slow movement of the tectonic plates that have been laid in place by World War II. But we don't know quite what's going to happen next. For 40 years, the United States defined its strategy by the Soviet threat. And many Americans now say, well, if the Soviet threat is gone, will there be a new enemy? Will there be a new type of Cold War? Will it be an economic Cold War? Will it be a Cold War with our former allies, like Japan or Europe? I think that that's the wrong answer. I also think it's the wrong question. It's the traditional question of international politics, which is where will be the great new challenge, the great new competitor in this cycle of hegemony. Robert Gilpin, who I have mentioned earlier, teaches political science at Princeton, has written that, alas, there's probably little that we've learned about international politics over the years that we can't already find in Thucydides. And of course, Thucydides gave us this description of war coming about when you have the rise in the power of one state creating fear in another state. And if that's true, if it's a situation where when one country is declining, another rising, that gives rise to these huge hegemonic wars that shake the international system that have brought such devastation in the earlier parts of our century. And if this happens in a nuclear age, then that cycle of hegemonic wars may indeed lay to the last of all hegemonic wars. I think that cycle, that description of the world as going through these types of hegemonic wars may now be over. It may be gone. But that's a very speculative question. In any case, I think that the portrait of a situation in which both superpowers are in decline is also wrong. I think that the picture of the United States as declining is exaggerated. There is now in the academic community something of a debate which Professor Paul Kennedy at Yale, the author of The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, has categorized as a debate between declinists and revivalists. He would say that he agrees or tends to agree with the declinist school, which is those who believe that the U.S. position is going to continue to worsen. He's categorized me in reviewing my book, Bound to Lead, The Changing Nature of American Power, as a revivalist, which he says are people who believe that while the United States has problems, that they can still be remedied. So I think one of the questions that we want to ask as trying to understand a post-Cold War world is what is going to happen to the relative power of the United States? Will the United States decline? And will a situation of rise and fall, as we've seen in earlier periods in history, lead to another cataclysmic conflict, and in this case, in a nuclear era, perhaps a far worse cataclysmic conflict than we've seen thus far? Let's look first at the facts about decline in relation to the United States. If you compare the United States today with the United States in 1945, quite clearly the Americans have declined. The World War II, however, has a big amount to do with that. World War II had a very different effect on the United States than other countries. World War II strengthened the United States, both economically and militarily, while it weakened everybody else. So the Americans came out of World War II with, if you sense, an artificially high position. Some people have estimated that at the very end of the war, the Americans may have controlled about half of the world's production, or world product. And by 1950, when more careful measurements were done, the estimate was that the Americans controlled about 35% of world product. Now, if you ask today what do the Americans control, it's about 23% of world product. So if you start in 1950 and you go to 1990, over that 40-year period, there's clearly a decline. On the other hand, there's another way of looking at that, which is to say that if you start your measurement not in 1945 or 50, but in 1975, the American share of world product is held constant at about 23%. So instead of drawing that line as a straight downturn, you should draw it as a dogleg, which has a plateau for the last 15 years. Another way of looking at that is that the Americans spent the first quarter of a century after World War II giving back to others the artificial amount that the Americans had won from World War II. And that since that time, the Americans have held roughly their share of world product, which is about the proportion that it was on the eve of World War II. So that's a picture that doesn't suggest continuous decline, but suggests, if you want, a working out of the World War II effect and then return to relative normalcy. Now, some will say, yes, but that's too simple. It's not the American share of world product that we should use to measure decline. It's the overall problem that you shouldn't be looking at the overall problem. You should be looking at the particular problem of industry, and that the problem of the United States is deindustrialization, the hollowing out of American industry. But that doesn't fit the facts very well either. If you ask, is the United States being deindustrialized in terms of industry's share of world product, it's about the same in 1990 as it was in the mid-70s, about 21-22% of GNP. And if you look at the question of, in terms of purchasing power parities of what currencies will buy, the American share actually goes up somewhat during the 1980s. Moreover, the American productivity in industry, in manufacturing, rose by about 3.5% a year during the 1980s. Not the sign of being hollowed out in industry. So while there may be particular sectors, consumer electronics, share of the automobile market, and so forth, where particular sectors may have trouble or be declining, it's hard to reconcile those particular sectors' problems with a picture of the United States as a whole as being in industrial decline when you have the aggregate numbers that I just mentioned. Now, sometimes the declinists will switch not from these aggregate facts, or they'll say that the aggregate facts aren't catching a refined enough picture. They'll say to get the long picture, what we need is to look at some historical analogies. And they'll argue that the United States at the end of the century is basically going through something very similar to what the British went through at the beginning of the century, and that these are similar type societies, and that we can learn a lot from looking at the experience of British decline. But it seems to me that there are three major differences there. One is a difference of scale. In 1900, Britain was the third largest military power and the third largest economy in the world. On the eve of World War I, Germany had passed Britain, as we saw, in terms of its industrial production. And the United States, whatever its other problems, remains the world's largest economy and I think the largest military power, which is very different from the situation that Britain faced in 1914 when it was hard-pressed, indeed passed, by the Kaiser's Germany. A second difference is the difference in terms of nationalism. Britain at the end of World War I was indeed the strongest, the British Empire was the strongest political unit in the world. But that's only if you include all the aspects of the empire. Britain, the island, was not that strong. So as nationalism grew in the domains of the British Empire, growing first in areas like Australia, New Zealand, and so forth, Canada, This tended to dissolve the cohesiveness of the British Empire, and in 1926, British planners, defense planners, felt they could no longer count so automatically on Britain acting as one empire in the time of war. In 1914, when Britain declared war, London declared war for the whole empire. By 1926, the planners could no longer assume that the others would automatically follow. So nationalism had a corroding effect on British power. Again, whatever the problems of the United States, that sort of national disintegration has not been a major problem, at least since 1865. And third, I think one has to remember that power is always relative, and the challenge that Britain faced from the Kaiser's Germany is very different from the challenge that the United States faces today. I mentioned the Germans had passed, Imperial Germany had passed Britain both in economic and military power, and were hard pressed against the Britain. The United States finds that its major military competitor over the last 40 years is in decline, and its major economic competitors, Europe and Japan, are not challenging it in terms of military power. So there are important differences there. I would therefore say that just arguing from an analogy of what happened to Britain to the United States is a misplaced historical metaphor. Another version of the argument that the declinists use is a theory of imperial overstretch. Imperial overstretch goes something like this. The argument says that an economy grows, it's vibrant, it stretches its interests worldwide, its economic interests, then it develops a political military structure to defend those worldwide economic interests. Eventually that military political machine gets so expensive that it eats away at the domestic base, and that then leads to decline. If that theory is true, then the burden of protection should continue to go up over time and thereby eat away this domestic base. If you look at the facts, and actually that fits quite nicely with many of the situations in history, situations where, for example, in Louis XIV's France or Philip II's Spain, something in the range of 75 to 90% of the budgets were going to the various military adventures. If you look at the American situation, what you find is that the burden of defense and overseas political structure has actually gone down over time. At the height of the Cold War in the 1950s, it was about 10% of GNP. In the 1980s, even after Reagan's military buildup, it was about 6.5% of GNP. And it's projected that it'll probably go down somewhere in the range of about 4% of GNP in the 1990s. So the curve of burden is going down rather than going up, as the theory of imperial overstretch would suggest. What's more, you see some of the major adjustments in the American position occurring really in the early 1970s, at the period when the American share of product has gone back more to its normal position. Some of the cases where the Americans overreached themselves, overextended themselves, like Vietnam, those were defeats that were suffered and acknowledged in the early 70s. The Americans similarly closed the gold window, the convertibility of the dollar into gold at about that time. So some of the major adjustments to the changed American position in the post-war period really happened in the Nixon administration, and rather than happening as a continuous decline today. Indeed, if one wants to find a case of imperial overstretch, one can find it probably best by looking at the situation of the Soviet Union. There is a case where, in fact, the burden of the political military posture has continually increased over time. At one point, the Soviets didn't publish a realistic defense budget, and they would give numbers which were quite useless, and so the American CIA would try to estimate Soviet defense expenditures and their share of GNP by observing what the Soviets were producing. And the CIA came up with an estimate that said that the Soviets were using about 17% of their GNP for defense. There were heated arguments about this, and last year there was a meeting in the era of glasnost, between Soviet economists and some people from the CIA and other economists near Washington to discuss this. And the Soviet economists were very critical of the CIA numbers. They said they're much too low. that in fact the Soviets have been spending probably over 20%, perhaps as much as 25% of their GNP on defense. That's a case of imperial overstretch. It may have a lot to do with the fact that Soviet health care was starved and that Soviet mortality rose during the 1970s. In any case, what you do find is that in the Soviet case, the Soviet share of world product has been going down. And I think it's not just because of that overstretch, which means that the Soviets have had a burden of 3 to 4 times as heavy in terms of defense as a percent of GNP as the United States has had, but also because the Soviet Union has not been able to cope with what you might call the first or the third industrial revolution. If the first industrial revolution was the application of steam to factory and transportation at the end of the 18th century, and the second was the use of electricity and synthetics and chemicals at the end of the 19th century, you could argue that the third industrial revolution at the end of our own century is the application of information to the economy, where the scarcest resource in the economy is the ability to use rapidly and flexibly information rather than land or natural resources or what have you. Now, the trouble that the Soviets found was that their Stalinist system, which relied on central planning, had been quite useful for an earlier stage when they were going into the second industrial revolution. The central planning system and the police state was very good at dragooning peasants off the land into factories to make steel or trucks or what have you. But when it came to dealing with information-based industries, where you needed to move very rapidly, this Stalinist system was a fetter that held them back. It was all thumbs and no fingers. Many of the new products that are made nowadays are smart products which embody information in the form of semiconductors or computer chips. Those computer chips often have a life cycle of about 3 years. So if you're going through a cumbersome planning system where it takes you several years to get permission and then get the information back and get the materials, the product may be obsolete before you first get to design it or to use it. In that sense, it's worth looking at a couple of numbers to illustrate how badly the Soviets fell behind in the third industrial revolution. At the time that Gorbachev came to power, the Soviets had about 50,000 personal computers in the whole country. At that time, the United States had about 33 million. Today, the numbers are estimated that something like 200,000 for the Soviets, about 40 million for the United States. Orders of magnitude behind. In addition to that, the Soviet economist Nikolai Shmelyov has argued that if you look at Soviet industry, that the Soviets have only about 8% of their industry which is of world standard. It's very hard to remain a superpower if 92% of your industry is subpar. So what we're seeing in the Soviet Union today is a major effort to catch up, to essentially to reach the level of economies such as the United States, Japan, or Western Europe in coming to terms with the third industrial revolution. And it's not something that can be done quickly, and it poses enormous dilemmas. Frankly, this word that was first a cliche of the second Russian Revolution now is becoming a second Russian Revolution in the sense that changes are bubbling up from below, and we don't know how it's going to turn out. It may be a little bit like trying to predict where the French Revolution would go if the year were 1790. We hope it'll turn out well. We hope it'll turn out peacefully. But the question of how long it will take and how it will go is very much an unknown. Now, that also raises questions about the type of world that we'll see, or what images we'll have of a post-Cold War world. One proposal that people have given of what a post-Cold War world might look like is to say that it will return to bipolarity, that Gorbachev will be overthrown by the hardliners, that hardliners will return a Stalinist system of sorts, or at least a tight system, that will bring back sort of a little Cold War, and that we'll see the more familiar world that we knew for 40 years. I think not. If Gorbachev were removed and you had a new hardline government, I think what it would do was accelerate decline. It would not reverse it, because it would not bring about this broadening and opening which is necessary to enter the information-based economy. Indeed, I think it's quite possible we may not be talking about the Soviet Union in a few years' time, or at least not the Soviet Union as we know it today. So I think a return to bipolarity, which some suggest, is not a very likely picture of a post-Cold War world. A second view that people sometimes give is that, well, if it's not bipolarity, then the post-Cold War world must be multipolarity. And the term is often used quite loosely. It's a little bit difficult if one uses the term multipolarity in a metaphor for earlier periods in international history like the 1930s or like the 19th century. Because then we talked about multipolarity. We talked about countries that were roughly equal in their power. Not exactly the same, but roughly equal, which could form shifting balances and try to have a balance of power of multiple polarities. The difficulty with that is that if you look at the world today, it's hard to see equality in the power. China, very much a developing country, and will be for quite some time. Europe could be an equivalent power to the United States if it had unity. But the question is, how much unity and how quickly will it come? Japan might be a credible contender for multipolarity. Japan has had a rapid rise, tripling its share of world product over 20 years, becoming the world's largest creditor, the world's largest aid donor. But Japan has not developed commensurate military power. Now, one might say, oh, it's just a matter of time. Of course that they will develop commensurate military power. But military power doesn't always follow economic power in a close one-for-one relationship. After all, the United States became the world's largest economy late in the 19th century, but didn't become a dominant military power in terms of the global balance until some 60 or 70 years later. So it's not clear that the Japanese will go in a military direction because in addition to that historical reason, there are problems for Japan in terms of the fears it may stimulate in their neighbors and in terms of Japanese domestic opinion. In addition, the Japanese have not yet thought through a world role which would give them the cultural and ideological appeal that have often gone with major power positions. So the picture of multipolarity that assumes that these are countries of roughly equal power, which are balancing each other, it strikes me is not, again, a perfectly accurate picture of the post-Cold War world. Another version of this is just an economic version, which says, well, a third picture of a post-Cold War world will be a three-block world. What we'll see is Asia organized around Japan in some larger Japanese-dominated Asian economy. What you'll see is North America and South America organized around the United States, and Europe essentially with Africa as an appendage, but Europe extending into the eastern regions as the third block in the world economy. There are some tendencies in that direction, but it may be too simple. It runs against at least two things. One is the global trends of technology. As multinational corporations that I mentioned in the first lecture grow more important, they realize that many of the technologies they're exploiting are best exploited if they're used across all large economies or all large markets, and they may not necessarily want to be tied into just one-third of the world market. The picture of a three-block world may also run across nationalism. If you talk to Chinese or Koreans or Southeast Asians, the last thing they want is to be locked up alone with the Japanese in some sort of new version of the East Asian co-prosperity sphere. They want access to broader parts of world markets. Similarly, Latin Americans may not relish the idea that they are locked up only with the United States, and Eastern Europeans may feel the same way about too tight a relation with a Europe that includes a dominant Germany. So it's not clear that the three-block world is going to be the picture of the post-Cold War world anyway, either. So a fourth picture, which is harder to describe, but which you might call multiple interdependencies or polycentrism in the sense of interdependencies, may be closer to reality. It may be that what we'll have is a world in which there'll be many different games played in different areas, trade, money, space, military affairs, in which the constellations of power, the structure of power, and the processes will be quite different in different areas. But the one country I suspect which will be best positioned to play at most of the tables is likely to remain the United States. If that's true, then a picture of the overall international system may be one in which the Americans stand still as the largest power and less constrained in terms of bipolarity than during the Cold War years. Now, one might say, well, that's amazing. Does that mean that rather than decline, the Americans are going to become a new hegemon, or that we have some unipolarity, or that the Americans will be able to wreak their will on the world? I think the answer to that is no, that being number one ain't going to be what it used to be. And that even if the Americans remain the largest state, that the Americans and all other large powers will suffer something different, what you might call diffusion of power, which essentially is not the traditional change of power where a new hegemon challenges for leadership, but if you want, in which power leaks out or spreads to all countries, often smaller and weaker ones. Let me give you 4 examples that I use in my book as illustrations of diffusion of power. One is the change in the role of force and the rise of nationalism in otherwise small and weak states. If you take the situation where, as we mentioned in the first lecture, a country has a population which is socially awakened, which is nationalistic, it's much harder to use military force to control them. It's one thing to see a situation where an outside country goes in and gets out quickly. It's another thing to see them try to conquer or control the population of a socially awakened, nationalistic developing country. The American loss in Vietnam and the Soviet loss in Afghanistan stand as the prime examples. Well, one can also do a little thought experiment. If in 1953 the United States was able to put the Shah of Iran back on his throne with a small covert action, ask yourself the mental experiment of how many troops would it have taken for the Americans to have put the Shah of Iran back on his throne in the nationalistically and socially awakened Iran of 1979. The answer is too much. So in that sense, the diffusion of power is to populations in otherwise small or weak states. It doesn't mean that Iran is a new challenger to the United States. It means that Iran and populations of less developed countries are better able to resist outside control. Another example of diffusion of power is the growth of economic interdependence and the effects of markets on what goes on inside major countries. If you look at the question of interest rates in the United States, which has a strong effect on the American economy, the Federal Reserve System tries to set interest rates. It has some effect on short-term interest rates. But over the long run, what happens on interest rates in the United States and their effect on growth depends on confidence of people in many parts of the world. Essentially, you could argue that American interest rates are set to a large extent by millions of people watching little green screens in Frankfurt, in New York, in San Francisco, in Tokyo, all over, making judgments as to whether they think the economic policies that the United States is following are going to be consistent with higher or lower interest rates. In that sense, then, there's a diffusion of power, not to another country, but to private actors acting through transnational markets. So that's another example of diffusion of power. A third example of diffusion of power is not to private actors, but is to small and weak states in other terms, and that's through the spread of technology. With time, technology spreads. And if you look at some of the technologies of mass destruction, chemical weaponry is now, a 70 or 80-year-old technology. Nuclear weaponry is a half-century old. Ballistic missile technology, 3 or 4 decades old. And with time, with that spread, smaller and weaker states are able to project more devastating capabilities and threats. And that doesn't mean that a country which is moving in this direction, let's take Pakistan as a state that's often cited as developing nuclear missile technology, that doesn't mean Pakistan is the new challenger to the United States in the model of traditional hegemonic challenges that Gilpin and others talk about. It does mean, however, that Pakistan is able to exert more force to make more threats in the area of South Asia or the Indian Ocean. And fourth, as an example of diffusion of power, there's a change in the agenda of international politics, something again that I referred to in the first lecture. that there are a number of items that are coming up in the daily newspaper which are items which are different from the traditional type of issues that states have contested in the past. Global warming, the problem of less developed country debt and the effects of that on the international banking system, trade in drugs, terrorism. These are often issues in which the traditional instruments of military power or economic sanctions are not sufficient to deal with. There are issues which are transnational, which they have a foot deep in the society of one country and the society of another. Issues which often require a fair degree of cooperation, transnational cooperation, to be able to deal with. They also transform, if you want, or provide a certain degree of power to the weak. It's called the power of collapse. Imagine a situation in which a country, let's call it Peru, has people who are growing coca leaves in the Andes, which lead to cocaine, which comes into American cities. And the United States government says, we'll get tough with Peru, and we'll use our traditional power instruments to get them to stop having their populace grow coca leaves in the Andes. Well, we could blockade the port of Callao. We could have economic sanctions against Peru, and we could probably bring down the government in Lima. Would that increase or decrease the amount of coca leaves grown in the Andes? Probably increase them. Probably have no effect in terms of the availability of cocaine in American cities. So what this suggests is that that the traditional instruments of power are often not very effective in dealing with some of these issues, and that what you need is the cooperation and assistance of otherwise small and weak states. So these are transformations of the nature of international politics which suggest a diffusion of power, which is very different from this image of how international politics has worked in the past that we've looked at in the great conflicts of the century, which related to this view of power being one of these things that leads to hegemonic transitions and great wars resulting from that. It may be that we're entering a period in world politics where obviously military force remains important, as we have seen in a case like the Persian Gulf, but in which the mix of power means that there will become somewhat less coercive and less flexible or fungible in the past. A.J.P. Taylor, the British historian, argues that traditionally the test of a great power was its capacity for war. But it's not clear that a capacity for war is going to say how well a state is able to achieve its purposes in the world that I've just described in terms of diffusion of power. It may be that one needs a much more refined and variegated assessment of power resources. I argued that power is the ability to achieve one's purposes, and when we used a definition of power, when we talked about the balance of power, we used a behavioral definition in terms of the ability to command others, to get others to do what they otherwise wouldn't do. Let me now suggest that there's another dimension of power, which is the ability to co-opt rather than to command, the ability to get others to want what you want rather than just to make them do what they otherwise wouldn't do. And in that dimension of power, the ability to co-opt, to get others to want what you want, it may be that the kinds of resources that are most relevant to that are different from the traditional power resources. Maybe we should divide power resources into the tangibles and into the intangibles, or into what I would call hard and soft power in my book. And hard power would be obviously your military force. Hard power would be your economic capabilities. Your soft power resources would be your ability to have a culture which appeals to others, the ability to have an ideological appeal which make others want to follow you, your ability to use international institutions to set the agenda so that you structure problems in a way that's more sympathetic to your approach. If that's true, then when we look at events like the events in August 1990 in the Persian Gulf, and we try to understand why the Americans, who had been to some extent seen as in decline, turned out to have this strong effect in the initial responses to the Persian Gulf, we have to look at the fact that the Americans had both hard and soft power. It was important for the United States to be able to get the 82nd Airborne and troops to Saudi Arabia quickly to deter further Iraqi movement, but it was equally important for the United States to be able to organize a coalition to get resolutions passed in the United Nations that describe this situation as a situation of aggression rather than retrieving a lost colonial possession, and which allowed the Arab countries to send troops, which allowed Islamic Turkey to close off the pipeline, which allowed essentially the Saudis to accept the presence of foreign troops on their soil. So in that sense, the Persian Gulf events of August 1990 are an illustration of a combination of both hard and soft power resources. It would be a mistake to ignore either one. And there are also other things which give rise to soft power resources. For example, a human rights policy, which was often scorned by realists as cheap moralism, may turn out to be a very important part of a foreign policy in a post-Cold War world. It may be that a country that stands up for human rights, that practices as well as preaches, may be a country which is a country that others want to follow. If you want others to want what you want, that your position on human rights may be something that turns out to be an important soft power resource. And ironically, in a post-Cold War world, the Americans may have to do less in terms of embracing odious dictators on the grounds that if we don't embrace them, the country may shift to the other side, to the Soviet side, and may be able to stand up more for some of the ideals that have traditionally been important, at least in our preaching, if not always in our practice. So as we look at a post-Cold War world, we're going to have to look at a different form of power relations, at both hard and soft power resources, and to spend much more time thinking about diffusion of power rather than these traditional models of hegemonic war and the great conflagrations that have gone with them. What that means, I think, is that in a post-Cold War world, the United States is going to have to look for a different type of strategy than has guided it through the earlier parts of the century. For the last 40 years, the U.S. grand strategy was one of containing Soviet power and maintaining an open international economy. And it seems to me that in a post-Cold War world, there are going to have to be at least 5 parts to a successful strategy. One, which I think goes back to what we've said since the beginning of these set of lectures, is to make sure that we don't forget and don't neglect the geopolitical balances. In a world of self-help, in a world of sovereign states, to ignore military force and military balances would be mistaken. I think Saddam Hussein reminded the world of this quite dramatically in August 1990. And in that sense, a prudent regard for military balances and updating of those relationships that have been important in this dimension is going to be part of a strategy. Second, I think, is the Americans are going to have to continue that part of their traditional strategy of maintaining an open international economy. Having a world with trade, direct investment, which flows across borders, is a source of strength, even if it's sometimes uncomfortable for particular pressure groups. The economist Mansur Olson, in his work on the rise and fall of nations, argues that the one way to really bring on decline is to use government power to protect vested interests, and that's what protectionism is. A third aspect of a strategy for a post-Cold War world is going to be paying more attention to the questions of democracy and pluralism. It may well be that the best chances of diminishing conflict over time go back to one of those liberal insights that Immanuel Kant cited, not merely the greater destructiveness of nuclear weaponry, but the prospect that democratic states are less likely to fight with each other. Democratic states often get involved in wars, not so much in wars with each other. So the promotion of democracy and pluralism may also be relevant not only for the soft power, but also for the prospects of peace that it provides. Fourth, in a post-Cold War strategy, is to pay more attention to multilateral institutions, something which was not high on our priorities in the 1980s. If many of the issues on the agenda of international politics are going to be issues that deal with transnational interdependencies, where you can't just coerce another state into getting what you want, but need to persuade them to cooperate or to develop ways to deal with this, then multilateral institutions will be important. The International Monetary Fund for debt problems, the International Atomic Energy Agency for control of the proliferation of nuclear weapons, trying to get a chemical and biological warfare convention to control the spread of chemical weaponry, and so forth. And finally, in a world in which much depends upon your soft power at home, and much depends upon the capability of your economy in an information-based era, we're going to have to pay much more attention to domestic problems. The United States is going to have to think more clearly about a deficit which has eaten up 3% of our GNP in consumption that we're not willing to pay for. We're going to have to think more clearly about raising the rate of savings in the country. And above all, we're going to have to do more for education. In a world where 25% of our high school age students don't complete high school, but a world in which information-based technology is increasingly important, where a service industry job is not flipping hamburgers but is punching a keyboard, we cannot afford to waste a quarter of our population, as well as for human reasons not wanting to do so. So in that sense, we're going to have to follow a strategy for effectiveness in a post-Cold War world which combines those international questions and dimensions which go back to the traditional view of international politics, but also deals with these newer dimensions that deal with questions which reach deep into our own society and cross national borders. Now, when people think about this, they say, well, that's all very well and good, but we can't afford it. It's just too much. We have to turn inward, turn to ourselves. We can't afford both international security and social security at the same time. Well, the answer to that is wrong. The United States is the most lightly taxed of all the advanced industrial countries, believe it or not, with about 31% of GNP going to government. Countries like Britain and France, that number would be about 44%. And during the 1980s, the United States transferred several percent of its GNP from savings and investment to essentially current consumption, primarily government consumption, by giving ourselves a tax cut at the same time that we put up spending. So in that sense, the problem in the United States for dealing with a post-Cold War world will turn out, I think, not to be a metaphor of economic decline, such as Britain faced when it was hard-pressed by the Kaiser's Germany, but will turn out to be a question of domestic politics. The question will be not, as it's sometimes put, that we have the will but not the wallet. We have the wallet. The question is, will we have the will? Now, sometimes people will say, well, don't worry about this. Maybe declinism is good. Maybe it'll frighten us into doing the things that we ought to do. But the danger of belief in decline as your picture of the post-Cold War world is it may lead Americans to say, well, we can't afford it. Therefore, we'll turn inward, we'll protect ourselves, we'll stop playing the role that we otherwise should play. And that would be unfortunate if we can afford it, which I think we can. It would be also unfortunate if this picture of the world as one in which you continually went through these cycles of rise and fall of nations leading to great hegemonic wars led us to follow policies that led to a new Cold War, on the misimpression that that's the way history always has to be. In a sense, it's a mistake to cry wolf. We should call the shots as we see them, face up to the problems we have and deal with them, and not use historical metaphors either for a cause for complacency or for a cause for despair. In a sense, what you might say is that the lesson of a post-Cold War world, perhaps the lesson of this whole set of lectures, is beware of historians bearing false analogies. As my colleague Ernest May has put it, history doesn't repeat itself. At best, it sometimes rhymes. Our future is still open, and it's very much in our own hands. And that may be the best lesson that we get from these studies of the great conflicts of our century.